I'm Jessie Mahoney, and I'm a pediatrician and a longtime physician leader at Kaiser Permanente or TPMG, depending on which version of the organization you know about. And I have done both department leadership and wellness leadership for many, many, many years. And the reason that I bring that up is I think sometimes when we're thinking about efficiency and prioritizing, there's this tug of war between systems and the people working in the systems. And so I have been on all the sides, if there are sides, and I think that helps just with sort of how you are thinking about the situation. And so the last 4 years, I actually transitioned to full-time coaching and physician wellness because I had spent about 18 years working in it before, and I realized that outside my own system, I actually had more nimbleness and flexibility to do what I knew worked. And as many of you know, working in big medical institutions, while they mean well, it's very hard to make change quickly, and it's very hard to be nimble in large systems. And so I switched over to full-time coaching. I also am a yoga and mindfulness teacher, and that is relevant in both the title of today's session, which is Pause to Prioritize, but mindfulness and sort of yogic philosophy is one of the things that we miss often in coaching in terms of having changes stick. And so we can often willpower ourselves into making change, but when we don't bring in mindfulness, it actually doesn't stick. And so one of the intentions of today's episode, to pause, is to help that stick. I also do a lot of retreats where I actually blend coaching and mindfulness, and that's what we're going to do today, because of that knowledge that I know that when you weave them together, they're synergistic, and that's what leads to actual change rather than sort of temporary change. And so I do all of these at what I call pause and presence, and that's where I do a lot of coaching. I do workshops, I do retreats, and I do them for institutions and for individuals because I think the focus is different in those two settings. And then I come to programs like this and do coaching. And I am someone who actually coaches on what I call full spectrum coaching or broad spectrum coaching. So I do parenting coaching, marriage coaching, career and transition coaching, leadership coaching, because I have a strong belief that you can't separate it out because we are not, there's not work life and home life. As a physician, there's all life and it all blends together. And so I think it's really important that we bring all of these things in. And as we're talking about prioritizing today in particular, we often pit one against the other. And so realizing that they are all a piece of the pie is very much relevant. And then the piece that I bring to the coaching that we'll bring in tonight is this mindfulness piece. And I'm going to bring it up over and over again because so much of us think that it's not necessarily the key to prioritization or the key to efficiency or the key to productivity, but it's often the missing piece for many people. And so I encourage you, if you haven't delved into it, there are a million ways to do it, and everybody can do it in some way. And it is something that we weren't taught in medicine, and actually that we don't share with patients in particular, that's really, really transformative for your life experience. So I also am a podcaster, and I like to bring that up. I have a podcast called the Mindful Healers Podcast, and a lot of the things I'm going to talk about today, we talk about there. So I encourage you to check it out if you haven't. And I do it with a colleague, Ni-Cheng Liang, who is a pulmonologist, adult pulmonologist in San Diego. And we bring a lot of different perspectives to the conversation of practicing in medicine today and how you can weave mindfulness into that. So I am also, and I will say last but not least, especially because we are prioritizing today, I am a wife. I've been married for 30 years to my neurodiverse husband. I'm a mom of 3 young adult sons who are now almost 28, 24, and 18, I believe. When they get that old, you forget exactly how old they are. I'm also a daughter of aging parents, which becomes more and more relevant. And I'm imagining for many of you, that's on your priority lists. And I have aging in-laws, and I'm a new mother-in-law, so I'm trying to figure that out, and a brand new grandma. And so with all of that, there's a lot to prioritize and organize. And this approach that I want to share today, this idea of mindful prioritizing, I think is a way to keep yourself calm and make it simple. And that's the key to this prioritizing. When we don't prioritize, our brains go to the negative, everything is complicated, and we spend our life reacting rather than being intentional and responding. And so we'll talk a bit more about that. So tonight we're going to talk about pausing to prioritize. And the second part of the workshop is going to be on the 28th. And that one I'm going to focus on prioritizing the pause. And the idea is to offer a framework where you can begin to live more aligned and calm life, which many of you might think feels impossible in the moment, but it is possible to have it be more aligned and calm, I will add. We're not aiming for perfection. But when you have done this work and you've actually paused to figure out what your priorities are and your priorities versus other people's priorities, many of us are living according to other people's priorities, everything will be more simple, and you will be spending your energy on what matters most. And I'm specifically going to talk a lot about energy. We think it's about time management, but I believe it's very much about energy management. And when we expend our energy on what matters most, then we have a much more calm, peaceful, purposeful life, which isn't perfect, but it is much more pleasant to be a part of. And then I'm going to share what I consider to be sometimes unexpected tools for prioritizing, and pausing is one of them. Mindfulness would be another. Self-compassion is one that we tend to not bring into this conversation at all, and efficiency, and I think it's critically important. And then listening is one of the others, because we were all taught in medicine not to listen to ourselves. And so it is hard for us to prioritize and hard for us to take time because our list didn't really matter along the way of training. So next time I will talk a bit about how prioritizing mindfulness and the pause is strategic, and rest being productive, and how to manage energy, and why this is so hard to do in healthcare, why we have a lot of thought patterns that get in the way, that keep us in thinking in ways that make this really challenging, and then why these things are important, what we know about the neuroscience, and how prioritizing pauses can actually be incredibly strategic in terms of being much more efficient and productive and living the life that you actually want to. So tonight, I'm going to run through why you should pause to prioritize, why prioritize at all, what you need to prioritize effectively and meaningfully, because I think a lot of us can rattle off our priorities, but what does that mean, and why have we put them there, and how do we align our life in that order? And then what should we prioritize? And then we'll actually do some practice of it and talk a little bit about how you can use your prioritized list to conserve your energy and be more efficient. So first off, why pause to prioritize? And I will say, in the mindfulness world, there's a saying that the pause is where your power and control lie. And so the pause, when you actually take the time to do it, is where you can choose how you want to live. And most of us in medicine don't choose. We just react. And we're constantly reacting to ping pong balls all day. And so if you have created a space where you can sit down and think about this, you will be not living in the ping pong ball life. You'll actually be living in more of an intentional life. And it doesn't take that much time. In fact, I would argue that you don't have the time not to do it, but many of us feel like we don't have time to pause. The other thing is that you can have a macro pause, like taking an hour and a half to talk about priorities, but you can also have little micro pauses in the day to reset and realign. And even a breath as a pause is an incredible tool to reset your focus and get yourself out of this autopilot reaction mode, which is where most of us live most of our days. And we'll talk a little bit about what that impact on your nervous system is and why it keeps you from living the life that you want. And so if you can train your nervous system and give yourself tools and tips to get back into your parasympathetic, calm, peaceful, intentional nervous system, you'll actually have more control over your day, which is what literally most people in medicine, we love control. It feels calm and peaceful, and yet we structure our days in ways that we don't have control. And so setting your priorities actually gives you back control, and taking a pause to do so does. And then getting out of this ping pong reaction and learning how to lengthen the pause is really magical for living a more aligned and peaceful life. And so the reason you should prioritize, and I think some of us feel like, oh, I just know what my priorities are, is that it helps you use your energy efficiently. And most of us don't use our energy efficiently. If we're spending time on things that aren't important, or we're reacting all the time, we're wasting energy, we're wasting time, and we generally aren't in this sort of peaceful, calm, what I like to call flow state, which is the least energetically expensive state. And so when you have your priorities, it makes it so much easier to stop wasting energy and time, and honestly money, on things that don't matter. And it creates this state of more calm. So there's less noise, less static. It's also a way of sort of going with the current instead of against the current. I think many of us feel like in our work lives that we're swimming literally against the current. And so when you have your brain targeted towards what you feel is most important and you're very clear on it, you can have some quick tools to help you stay aligned. It also is an easier way to make decisions. So I think it makes decisions simple. If you have your priorities aligned, you just line up, does this matter for my priorities? How do I make this decision in line with my priorities? And there's your answer. And so it ends up sort of cleaning things up. The other thing is, when you actually sit down to prioritize for yourself, many of us have spent our lives living someone else's priority list, whether it's a parent's priority list or your institution's priority list. And so reconnecting with your own priority list is critical in figuring out how you want to move forward in medicine. So also the act of prioritizing, which many people don't realize, is helps you in and of itself. And prioritizing, I liken to setting intentions or directing your brain's GPS to where you want to focus. And by setting intentions, there's neuroscience that shows you release dopamine and acetylcholine, and that is motivation in and of itself. So connecting with what you want more of, what your intentions are, what's important to you, actually helps your brain release things that feel good and make you motivated. And so oftentimes we don't act in alignment with our priorities. And so by setting these priorities and setting intentions, I sometimes use different words like intentions, wishes, aspirations. They can be a little softer, and your brain may have an easier time allowing your own wants and wishes in there. They also make it really easy to cross things off the to-do list. We have so many things on our to-do list that aren't in alignment with our priorities and probably should be either at the bottom or don't even really need to be done. And I think when you set your priorities, you realize that you're not going to spend your energy doing those things. You're going to spend your energy on what's more important. And then it helps you stay out of people pleasing when you get into, these are my priorities. We do a lot of people pleasing, which is never anybody's priority, but we don't even see it. So when you realize how often you're acting out of alignment with your priorities, it's usually pleasing people or being afraid of rejection, which most of us in medicine innately are. We were taught to be afraid of rejection. If we didn't do what we were supposed to, we will not get the residency, not get the fellowship, not get the promotion. And so we tend to be people pleasers in that realm. So when you are deeply connected to what matters to you and what your purpose and passion in the world are, it helps you spot that people pleasing earlier on, for sure. It doesn't mean you won't do any of it, but it helps. And then setting your priorities is also a form of, I call it minimalism. It's a way of sort of decluttering your life. When we don't have them, there's so much noise. And so when you have your priorities, you can pare things down to what's more important. It's a lot easier to say no. And it's a lot easier to quit things and stop things that are not your priority once you see what it is. It also helps you get rid of stuff. A lot of times we're keeping stuff because we think it's important, but when you line it up with your priority list, it's not at all important. And so I think that actually can help people simplify their lives, which makes things a lot more simple. So one thing I want to spend a little bit of time on is what's required to prioritize. And so one is actually time and attention to it. And most of us move through our lives, maybe at New Year's we prioritize, but that's about it. And we then wonder at the end of the year why our year ended up the way it was, or why we didn't change, or why we spend all our time doing things that don't feel important, whether it be at work or at home, or we're distracted. And so spending that time is really important, and most of us don't do it. And it doesn't take very much time. And in fact, it saves you time in the long run. So first of all, you have to pause to do it and set that intention to do it. But then in that pause, I like to say you have to have the right petri dish or milieu, or the other word I use is neurochemical soup. And so if you are completely stressed, completely depleted, and sort of mean to yourself in your list of priorities, it won't be an effective list, and it won't be an honest or authentic list. Or it will keep you in someone else's priority list. And so the key things to actually having this environment where you have the clarity, your snow globe has calmed down or the fog has cleared, is to literally slow down. So you can't make these decisions or see clearly from a place of overwhelm. You can't have clarity when your nervous system is in fight or flight. Many of us don't even recognize the role of physiology in the way we're moving through our days. So when you are in fight or flight, you can't change your mindset. You can't see your priorities clearly. You're literally reacting, as I mentioned. So thinking about this healthy physiology, if you are not releasing cortisol and norepinephrine and you're in more of a dopamine, compassion, oxytocin state, that's your state where your priorities will be aligned with what you actually care about. You will be able to connect with and listen to yourself, which most of us don't pause to do at all, to see what's actually important to you. And then the other thing that's really needed is, I will say, self-compassion. It could be non-judgment. It could be just kindness to yourself, but at least not being mean to yourself, because those and common feelings in medicine like shame, blame, and guilt, they all release cortisol. We don't make good decisions. We can't prioritize from an authentic, clear state when our body is bathed in those. And so when you're thinking about physiology, this is why mindfulness is so important, because mindfulness actually switches your physiology. It switches the neurochemicals circulating around, and then you can think more clearly. And so if you step out of prioritizing for a moment and just think about your day, we spend most of our days in sympathomimetic storm reacting. And so it's no wonder we're exhausted all the time. And so just noticing where you can have these micro pauses can be super helpful in getting clarity. And then the other thing that's needed to prioritize is relearning how to listen. And I will say we were explicitly taught in medicine to not listen to ourselves. You didn't have to go to the bathroom. You didn't need to sleep. Your priorities weren't your priorities because, as a resident, these were the priorities. And that continues on throughout our lives until we notice it and change it. And that's where I want to help you really think about what are your actual priorities right now versus someone else's priorities. And so this relearning how to listen, you have to slow down. And what I'm going to offer is it takes a lot of practice. It takes habits such as like hand to heart. Which is for me a physical embodiment practice of self-compassion. And for many of us in medicine, self-compassion is really hard. We were taught to be mean to ourselves, and that's how we got where we are. And that's our way to push ourselves to work harder and harder. And so this hand-to-heart practice, just acknowledging that you have a heart, for example, and that it has desires and wishes, is the first step in sort of checking in on how you feel. And otherwise, your priorities may or may not be your actual priorities. And so I think it's really important to begin to relearn how to listen. And that is something that can be done, with a mindfulness practice, with a yoga practice, even with pausing, sometimes in nature. There are lots of things you can do to calm your nervous system to help you do that. And I will say that for most of us in medicine, we don't have a healthy nervous system. It's very out of balance. And so realizing that is probably the first step. We also have to step out of non-judgment and begin to give ourselves either permission to want something. Most of us don't give ourselves permission to want something. That's selfish, not allowed, not okay. Or not judge ourselves for wanting something. When I grew up, it was very much like if you wanted something for you, that was selfish. And I will say that most people go into medicine kind of were raised that way or started out thinking that way. And it's part of the reason why we're so exhausted and burnt out in the end. And so not judging yourself for what you want, giving yourself permission, and then trusting that what you want is also okay and reasonable. And I know from working with hundreds of physicians over the years that we are trustworthy humans. The things we want are not bad for the world. They're generally good for the world. They're generally good for us. They're generally good for our families, and yet we usually ignore them. And so I encourage you to begin to trust yourself. I mentioned that I have a podcast, and there's an episode recently called It's Okay to Trust Yourself and the Process. And I've gotten so many emails about people who they hadn't even connected with the fact that they weren't trusting themselves, and they were making decisions from lots of other reasons besides trusting themselves. So I think it's a really important practice that honestly takes practice. I spent a whole year working on it. It was one of my words that I was working on, and it really just takes time. And then the last thing that I think is required to be able to prioritize effectively, so not just this list of 1, 2, 3, 4 of this, these are my priorities, and then you don't act in accordance with them, is I'm going to say an abundant mindset. But I also know that for most physicians, that's really hard to get to. So just neutral at least, but not coming from this place of scarcity where there's not enough time and there's not enough resources, and there's competition between all of the things that you want in life. And then you have to choose, because that makes the prioritizing very tension-filled, stressful. You're releasing all those neurochemicals that are not helpful in having clear decision-making. And it makes it hard to ground into who you are and what you want. And most of us have detached from that. And so I think that's the beautiful thing about prioritizing, is that all these things that felt really complicated become much more clear, and you're unwilling to sacrifice yourself for your current life. And most of us were trained in medicine to sacrifice ourselves and be martyrs. I always say that. It's not our fault. But when I trained, it was glorified. That was it, right? That was your, if you didn't sacrifice yourself and weren't a martyr, you weren't a good doctor. And so that plays into our priority list. Most of us are like, patients are on the top, but actually that's not sustainable. And I know Sarah's podcast is Sustainable Medicine, and that is not a sustainable approach. And so if you can come at priority setting from, there's enough time and resources for what's most important, not time for everything, but part of the work is that you are prioritizing so that you can figure out what's most important and figure out what's going to make your life get back into that flow. So you're in the current, flowing in the current rather than against the current, and you're not just wasting energy willy-nilly, which most of us are. So that's what I think is required. And then I thought we'd take a couple of minutes and practice a little bit of mindfulness. And I know that not all of you have a mindfulness practice, but what I want you to experience before we move on to priority setting is what it feels like to actually pause, and that it really doesn't take very much time. And so if any of you are driving, please don't close your eyes, and you can just breathe and relax, because I know a lot of you don't have your screens on, and I don't want to be responsible for that. But for those of you that aren't, or who can, find what I say your sit bones, which are ischial spines, and you'll connect them into something underneath you. And you'll find that spot where you feel safe and solid and grounded, not the scarce, stressed, spinning version of you, but the grounded, calm version of you. And we will literally pause and breathe. And so you can come back to your breath and breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. And we'll just do that 3 times, breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. And one more, breathing in through your nose. And let the exhale be a little longer than the inhale. And pause for another moment and just notice how you feel. And then I invite you to try this hand to heart practice, where you'll bring one hand and put it on your heart, and you'll put your other one atop. There's no exact right way to do it. Find a spot that feels okay to you. And you don't have to feel your heartbeat. You just have to know that your heart is in there, and that it is a human heart, and that you have one, and that it has wants and wishes and feelings and desires and hopes and dreams. And just taking a listen, seeing if you get any indication of those hopes and wants and desires and dreams without judgment. Mindfulness always doesn't judge. One of the key tenets of mindfulness. Breathing in and breathing out. Just taking a moment to listen. And as you are here with your hand to heart, thinking about how you would like to feel in life, what you would like to feel more of, what you would like to feel less of. Not all the time, of course, but more. And if that feeling that you want, perhaps calm or peace or free or grounded or settled or safe, if that were your guiding light, how would you change what you do in your day, how you show up for your day? What would be most important? And what might you stop doing in your day? What might you do a little more of? Or a little less of? And notice the word a little. 1% different, 5% different. Subtle is significant. And just noticing how you feel here, hand to heart, coming back to your breath, breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. And notice that sense of more calm. And notice the sense of connection to yourself and a bit of stillness, a bit of slowing down of your busy monkey mind. Noticing how you feel now. And we'll take 3 more breaths together, allowing yourself to enjoy them. In through your nose and out through your mouth. And then when you feel complete, ready, you can open your eyes and lower your hands. And just notice how you feel. And realizing that was less than 2 minutes. And so it can often make a big difference. I will tell you that I actually just practice hand to heart, literally just like this. I don't have to do all the other stuff anymore. And I feel better. And so if you have a simple practice of taking 3 breaths or practicing hand to heart, it can ground you and settle you and reconnect you to you and what's important to you. So once you have your list of priorities and the things that matter most to you, you will be able to drop back into those and get out of this reactivity. The other thing to notice is that when you feel the way you do now, you likely have your neurochemical soup is more willing to think and see clearly and make change potentially from where you are. So it becomes not I've been acting out of alignment with my priorities and why have I been doing that and how did I get here, as to what could I shift, what could I change. I also will say, separate from priorities, although it's probably a worthwhile priority, that you can do mindfulness before any difficult meeting, before a difficult patient, and you will get this same neurochemical switch that will make the experience better for you. And it will help you stay connected to what's important to you. And it doesn't have to be long. It can be 3 deep breaths, but it's not something we were taught in medicine, and it actually makes all of those things cost less energy and go more smoothly, which I'm certain having more energy is on all of your priority lists. So just this simple practice of mindfulness, it doesn't have to be complicated. What I will say is if you practice it regularly, you can drop in a lot more quickly. You're able to just drop in and feel better quickly. So I do encourage you to practice it regularly, but it also doesn't have to be hours. It can be very simple, very easy. So our next question here is, what should you prioritize? And again, I want to bring up that many of us prioritize what we think we should prioritize. And so rather than our own wants, the wants of other people in our life, maybe what our parents taught us to prioritize, what society teaches us to prioritize, what the culture of medicine teaches us to prioritize. And what the culture of medicine teaches us to prioritize may or may not be relevant today, is what I would like to say. A lot of the way that I was trained to prioritize in the early 90s does not apply to the practice of medicine today, because the practice of medicine today is totally different. I was coaching a rural family physician, and they have this idea of what rural family medicine is, but it actually isn't that anymore. And they're working in these big systems. You're not the local doctor who has their shingle. And so what you would have prioritized then is different to what you would prioritize now. And so I think it's really important to think about what you want to prioritize, trusting that you are an amazing human who has good intentions and has always wanted to serve and give to the world. What do you need to prioritize to do that most effectively? And so the questions that I would ask is, what matters most to you? And add the to you, not just what matters most, but what matters most to you. And what do you want to be doing with your life? And it's okay if it's not what you're doing now. And it doesn't mean you have to quit your job if it's not what you're doing now. You just want to notice what that is and allow yourself to see what it is you want, and let that be okay. And then coming back to that question I asked in the mindfulness, which is, how do you want to feel most of the time, not all of the time? And remembering from the coaching standpoint, and I don't know how familiar all of you are with the coaching model, but how we want to feel is very much how we think about things and how we approach things and the attitude that we bring to whatever we do. So it has less to do with what you're actually doing in your day than how you choose to show up for it. And so I think that's a beautiful way to be rethinking it. And what do you want to pay attention to in your life? So we have lots of things in our life, and we tend to pay attention to the negative in medicine. We tend to pay attention to what needs to be fixed. We tend to catastrophize about potential outcomes, and we put a lot of energy and attention there, and then we feel not so happy. And so how do you want to feel most of the time? What do you want to pay attention to? What do you want more of or less of? These are questions that can help you come up with a very true, authentic priority list that probably looks different than a list that you have come up with in the past. And so I'd love to take a couple minutes here, and I'll pause to give you a few minutes, but to really think about these feelings, because I think it's very helpful to make a list of the 3 feelings that you have most often now. And I want to give you the caveat that most doctors, when they answer this question, they think they have to have like 1 good one has to be in there, and they can only have 2 bad ones, or there's no right answer here. The 3 feelings that you have most of the time now. And if you want to put them in the chat box, I always think there is lots of help from realizing you're not alone. So if you feel comfortable, I know you can't do it anonymously, but feel free if you want to share the 3 feelings that you have most often in the spirit of people not feeling alone. Okay, so hectic and frazzled. Irritation. Oh, disjointed, that's a good one. Rushed, afraid, and frustrated. dread, guilt, and overwhelmed. Overwhelmed, tense, hopeful, fatigue, tired, late, frustrated, anxious, regretful, hopeful. Chaos, overwhelm, frustrated, guilty, hopeful, relieved on Friday afternoon, uneasy, tired, afraid, overextended. Yeah. And I would say whenever I ask these questions of people in medicine, those are the very usual answers, just to be fair. And so I would ask you just to think about why you feel that way. And many of you will say, because I have too many patients, or because I have this, or because I have that. But also think about your thoughts about it. Where are you thinking in ways that make you feel frustrated? And also thinking, because I talked about this neurochemical soup, right? These feelings tend to lead to cortisol, stress, norepinephrine, unhappy, unhealthy neurochemicals. And so to me, that helps me want to change from a good place, not from a stressful place. And so the next part of the question is, how would you like to feel most of the time, knowing that we don't feel good all the time? But what would you, if I asked you the feelings you'd like to have more of the time, what would they be? Lots of peace, harmony, calm, confident, calmer, blissful. That would be lovely. And so you'll notice there's a gap between how you feel most of the time and how you would like to feel. And so one question that can help you think about this prioritization is, what would you need to prioritize to feel more calm, more harmony, more enthusiasm, more free, more optimistic? Anyone have thoughts on what they might have to prioritize to feel some of the feelings that they would like? And I will tell you that mine used to be overwhelmed, drained, not valued, frustrated, irritable, exhausted, whatever, all of those at different points in time. And to be fair, it's also the end of the day, so many of you will be having more of the tired ones. We should have done this first thing in the morning. Oh, I like that, spirituality. So more spirituality would help you get from how you feel now to how you want to feel. I would add that for most of you, mindfulness would probably help a little bit. Being authentic, yeah, absolutely. Authentic and aligned. And so really connecting to what your priorities are can help you with that. Anyone else have thoughts about what they might need to prioritize to get to some of the feelings they would like? Feel free to pop those in the chat too. More of the things that bring me joy. Yeah, and changing your mindset. And so I do like to bring up that, we generally have a negative mindset. We were trained to have a negative mindset in medicine. So we look for what's wrong. We tend to catastrophize. We focus on the things that need to be fixed and changed. That's what we do in medicine. So we go home and do the same thing. And for those of you putting boundaries in there, we were trained to not have good boundaries. We were trained to sacrifice, to be a martyr, to, I call it over responsibility, be toxically independent. And so all of those habits, you would have to notice them and deprioritize them or unprogram your brain from that auto default, if that makes sense. And so I think that you need to notice that, well, okay, I need to set more boundaries. That's going to be on your priority list. And we'll get to priority list, but I do want to say that almost all of these involve you. And that means that you need to be on your priority list. And most of us were not on our priority list at all. So we'll get to that. And then this idea of convincing others of what you need and working with them on it. Now that is an interesting one because it may or may not be possible to convince others of what you need, and they may or may not be interested in working on it, as much as I would like to say they are. But I try to not resist reality. And so it depends on where you work, and it depends on what's happening in medicine. But I would say that if you decide what you need and decide from an internal energy that this is what's important to you, and you're going to live a life that's in alignment, because most of us don't want to live a life that's not in alignment. We feel very unsettled and exhausted and irritated, and a lot of these feelings you have are because you're not living your life in this moment in a place of alignment. And so I think it's helpful to notice what you need, and being clear about that. How can you give yourself more of what you need? How can you prioritize more of what you need? Because many of you who mentioned boundaries, if you prioritize more of what you need, that's in effect setting a boundary, but it's a lot easier than putting up big boundaries. The other thing that I like to offer from boundaries, which I think is really helpful, is boundaries should come from a place of love. And that love is for you. And if you're number one on your list, it's easy to set boundaries without actually having to set boundaries. And full disclosure here, I'm terrible at boundaries, because if I think of the word boundary, I get stressed out. It gets me into that scarcity competition. Someone wins, someone loses. But when I come at it from a place of love, and I'm not going to do that because I will feel bitter and resentful and I'm being over responsible or toxically independent, then it's very easy for me to say no. Or if I have a very clear priority list and this thing they're asking me to do is, off the bottom of the page, it's much easier to not people please and not worry about what people will think. And I want to reflect. So what I mean by over responsibility or toxic independence, over responsibility is taking responsibility for things that aren't yours. And many of us do that on our own. And medicine also asks us to do that. It asks us to take responsibility for my institution called them MPS scores, which are member patient satisfaction scores, but maybe they're Press Ganey scores. And most of that is out of your control. Part of it is in your control, but most of it's not. And so I think I'm a pediatrician, so we were responsible for whether people accepted their vaccines. That's actually over responsibility. I'm responsible for what I present to them, but there are some people who are not going to do it no matter what. And so when you realize that that is not authentic and aligned, it becomes not a priority. And it doesn't mean that doing a good job and showing up authentically is your priority. And showing up in a way, I like to say, that your future self would be proud. That's your priority, but not people pleasing. So it gets you out of these habits that tend to be very expensive energetically and emotionally. And I love this, someone put in here, less perfectionism would help them get from one to the other. And what I love is when you notice these things, noticing them as an act of mindfulness, noticing when you make decisions and when you live your life with these other things, perfectionism in charge, or some of these other things, a lack of boundaries in charge, or people pleasing is usually what comes from a lack of boundaries. That is causing you to be stuck in here. That's the first step. I actually think a lot of people think, well, now I have to go set these boundaries and I have to change all my thought patterns. And really, if you notice them, that's the most important thing. And that is not energetically expensive, just beginning to notice them, because then they're not in charge, you're in charge. And if you have clean boundaries on the other side, you're like, wow, this people pleasing is keeping me away from what's most important to me. And none of us want to live a life with that happening, if that makes sense. So, yeah, and please put your questions in the chat box, because that will help me answer them. So toxic independence is one of my favorites. I'm an expert at it, even though I know what it is, which means that you are all really amazing humans. And so you do things faster and more efficiently than most people, and you know the answers and you can take care of it. And the people you delegate to never do it quite as well, whether they be your spouse or your medical assistant or your nurse. And so, and especially if you're a leader, this is really dangerous, which was how I kind of got into it. It's like, well, I'll just do it myself. And so you do everything yourself because you're faster and you're more efficient. But in the end, you end up with many, many, many of those feelings y'all mentioned, like frustrated, irritated, heavy, overextended, shame, despair, tired, afraid. I'm just looking through them. Frustrated, guilty. Toxic independence leads to all of those. And so if you can just notice when you're doing it, again, you don't even have to change it. You can, one of the things I love is loving amusement. Have loving amusement for yourself, that's your default. Just like, oh, look at me, here I go again. Then you actually begin to stop doing it without this shame, blame, guilt. It's much easier. And for many of you, you may actually, as we're looking at priorities, you may want to put like noticing these thought patterns as something in your priorities, because if you were to notice them, your whole experience of being a physician wherever you are, and I know you all might not all be physicians, so I mean that as anybody working in medicine. I'm not sure exactly what you all do, but it's going to change your experience working in healthcare, 100%. Because it will be just less expensive. And we get out of victimhood is another one that we're all experts at. We were trained to be victims in medicine, and we were trained to give away our power and control. That works really well for the system, but it doesn't work well for us. And so once you start to see it, you're like, oh, wow, I'm a victim. You will all laugh, but I was a victim of the call center because they didn't book anything right. And I was a victim. We had a robot in our parking garage. I was a victim of that. And I spent a lot of energy. None of those, if you have a clear priority list, would be anywhere on your priority list. And yet I expended a lot of energy. So that would be an example of, if you don't pause to prioritize, you end up wasting all this energy, and then you are even frustrated before you've gotten into your office to answer anything. And the key thing there is just noticing it, because you can, some of these things, once you see them, you realize how useless they are to you, and they're not serving you, so you can let them go. And yes, someone commented on the showing up in a way that your future self would be proud. And if you struggle to think, okay, well, what are my priorities? Because I've spent so much time living with other people's priorities. Many of us spend a lot of time living with our institution's priorities because we're told constantly that that's the priority. I think consulting your future self, who's very wise, what will I wish I had done at 5:30 at night when I had all these charts to do? Your future self is much wiser than your current self, who's tired and hungry and exhausted and irritable. And so I like to think that your future self knows what you're good at. And she always, since someone commented, we're almost all women, she has your back. And so consulting her will be really helpful as you're thinking about, okay, well, what are my true priorities? Not the ones that other people are telling me. But, and again, when you're setting a priority list, it doesn't mean that you're never going to do your charts because they're not on your priority list, because I know this is like charting group, right? It doesn't mean that, but it's putting it in the context, and how much time do you want to spend on that versus how much time do you want to spend on something else, and where are you wasting energy, so that you can actually expend your energy on what matters most to you. So pop in the chat if any of you have any other questions, and if not, I thought we would pivot over to actually writing down your priorities. And you can do it in any way you want. There's no right order to this, but I think it's helpful for whatever you think your priorities might be right now. And you can use some of those questions that I mentioned along the way. How do you want to feel? What's most important to you? How you want to be living your life. So we'll take a couple minutes to write those down, and then we'll talk about them a little bit. So those of you, I can see at least some of you look done. And if you're not done, keep working on it. And I thought I would just show you, this is the one that I came up with. And so I actually now put myself first. This is all new. My original one, I'll show you when I was chief, it was almost the opposite. And then my second priority, I say, is my inner family. And that, I've actually been really clear more recently that my marriage comes first and my children's come second. And I will say almost everybody puts their children number one. And I'm going to talk about why I do it this way. And then third is work. And I'll talk about that. And then the fourth is what I call my outer family, because I have lots of outer family that need and want my attention because I'm the only doctor in the family. And then my friends also, because that's important to me, and all the other people out there. And I'm sure that there are more. I like to just keeps my brain very clean and simple. And so that's my current one. But when I was chief, I would say, and I'm embarrassed to show you this, but this is actually, when I thought about it, I was like, wow. But I mean, whether I didn't think about it at all. But this would have been my priority list, which is like, I did my admin first, my chief admin, because everything would fall apart if I didn't do it. That was my toxic independence and over responsibility. And I was responsible for the whole floor and everything that happened and all the staff. So that was first. And then I was wellness chief for years. And so I felt like my colleagues' health was all my responsibility too. And my patients were actually third, because there were other people around who could help with my patients, but there was no one else who could do these other jobs, even though I really felt guilty about this because I knew that they were supposed to be at the top, but they weren't. And then would come my children, because they needed me, though I did have a spouse who could also help with them. And then my husband was next. And then my family and friends was probably after that. And I was on the bottom. And this is not a healthy priority list. And I didn't actually have one, to be fair. But if I look at it, this is how I acted. And this is how I spend my energy and my time. And what I will tell you from this is I got burnt out. And my children turned out okay, actually. But my marriage had struggles. My husband was actually a full-time lawyer at the time, and he ended up having a lot of struggles himself and he had his own priority list that probably looked a bit like this. This is not healthy. And this is what happens when you don't make one and you just do what other people tell you, and you're in an environment where people say no one else can do this and no one else can do this. And so I think just realizing the difference between those, and one is an intentional priority list and one is what happens when you don't have one. And so I think it's helpful to take this priority list and think about, first of all, is your list your priorities or someone else's? And I'm guessing, because I already mentioned that hopefully your list is actually yours, but making sure that some things on there are actually your priorities. And you might think like, well, wow, why are my children almost third on the list? And I have a lot of reasons for that as I thought about it. And I think to me, it feels good. So are they your priorities or someone else's? And then are you on the list? And hopefully you're on the list. And then I would offer, are you number one on the list? Because I'm going to give you some reasons why I think you have to be. And I realize I should let you decide, but I'm going to give you a persuasive argument in case you didn't put yourself number one. And then the next question is, why are they in the order that they are? Like thinking about your order. Why did you put them in that order? And so I know I didn't really tell you to put them in a specific order, but I think it's helpful to rank order them, not because there's a scarcity of resources, but because you want to be thinking about what's most important and what makes your life work, and being strategic. And when I say strategic, I'm thinking about health, happiness, and energy management, not so much in like getting a leadership role. If you are strategic with your health, happiness, and energy management, you will be able to do all the things you want to do because you're all clearly impressive people. So my current list, where I am number one, that's because I'm well coached. And I will just tell you, I didn't used to be on the list at all. And so I know that whoever is, most of you are women, and that means that most of you are the leader in your family, and many of you are leaders at work. And if the leader is not healthy, nobody else gets what they need. And then you don't have capacity for all the things you want to do. And all the people depending on you won't get the care that they need. And so I think putting yourself number one is super important. Now, we were not taught to do that. We were taught to put everyone ahead of us. And many healthcare organizations still say the patients are first. And I'm like, they can't be first. They can be equal, but they can't be first. And really, the people caring for them have to be first. But I want to acknowledge that for many of you, it's going to be really uncomfortable to put yourself first. And if you were to take this project and make it a micro project about like what your priorities at work are, I still invite you to put yourself first on the priority at work. Because when we get there, we start to think about all of our responsibilities. And really, you still need to be the priority. You still need to go to the bathroom and eat food and sleep and do all those things. Otherwise, you can't function well. And the systems won't function well. So if you go into self-sacrifice and martyrdom, which is what we were trained, you're not on the list and or you don't do it well. So I also invite you, if you are number one on the list, to think about what you need to do more or less of for yourself to function at your highest level as, and if you are a mom or something else, what would you need to do that? And there's this question about if family is a high priority, how not to prioritize work when there's a desire to support them. I will say that's why my work is number 3. If my child were sick and had cancer, they would obviously go in front of work. But work is pretty important because you need the money. You need to take care of your family. And for most of us, it's important to passion and purpose and why we're here, even though sometimes we feel like we've lost that piece. So I think it goes on there, but for most people, it doesn't supplant, their inner family is what I'll say. I actually think it does supplant outer family, and outer family might be your parents or your in-laws or your brothers or your sisters or and even friends. But your inner family who potentially doesn't have other people to support them probably go first. And again, this is coming from not scarcity or abundance, but there's enough time for things that are most important. So in any given moment, at 2 o'clock on a work day, your work is probably more important, but at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, that may switch. And so again, it's not a one versus the other. I like to think of it as creating a pie. And a pie is a specific recipe of different amounts of different things. And when the pie is over full, your over capacity, it leaks all over the oven and makes a mess and catches on fire. And it's very, so you don't want an overfull pie. And if you get your recipe off, it doesn't taste good. And so you're making your own recipe rather than this versus that. It's a little bit more of this and a little bit less of that. And at different times, like right now, my kids are older, so they need less of my personal attention. When they're toddlers, they need more of your attention. And so your list is going to shift. I do, though, when it comes to family, encourage you a lot. I see a lot of women in medicine not paying attention to their relationships. And then they are in the midst of divorce, which is very expensive. I do a lot of relationship coaching. It's very expensive, emotionally, energetically, and monetarily. And it's also not good for your wellness or your family if you can prioritize it. Now, not all marriages are healthy, but you want to make sure that that is something on your list. We generally put our kids below it, but our kids struggle if we don't prioritize it. And when you get to my other end, your children leave and you're still married. And then you still have the marriage. So you actually, that lasts a lot longer than the family time. And so making some amount of time for it, I really think is important. And for me, I think it's a very conscious thought. And I just see this time and time again working with people who don't prioritize it and they think they'll just get back to prioritizing it later. But that is hard to do. And then my thought about kids is this, that they would still be above work, but there are other people who can help you with them. So your spouse can help you with them. Usually family can help you with them. There's, daycare schools can help you with them. There are lots of other people in their life that aren't just you. And if you can trust other people and the key thing here is to trust that your kids will grow up mostly happy, healthy, mostly responsible, mostly independent, then you can allot enough time to them, but not too much time. And that's one where I really invite this asking your future self. If they turned out okay, how would you handle this situation? Let's just say they were having mental health issues. I think you would spend a lot of time. But would you go to every single soccer game? Or would you, do the things that you do for school that maybe aren't high priority? If they're going to turn out okay, would this be on your priority list? That to me is a very helpful question. And it gets back to that trust piece. And so if you can trust that things will turn out mostly okay, what would you do? And then number 3 is, for me, business or work, because you need money and your family needs you to make money and you need to pay your rent and you need to pay for your food. And then it's also important, most of the work that we do. But I think that's where you can put it in that category. For some of you, it's going to be higher on the list. Maybe you're the only breadwinner and you have a stay-at-home parent. Then maybe your work is more important. And it's not like a judgment. We want to judge this and say like, well, who would do that? But maybe in your family system right now, that's more important. So, but I think realizing that it may or may not be. And then this outer family and friends, I put them lower to keep me out of over responsibility. My family will call me about health issues all the time. And, people want your advice, and you can get caught up in family, in-law drama, etc. And so when you realize that they come after these other things, you can just be immediately decisive about whether you're going to answer something or not, and how quickly and how much time you're going to spend on the weekend if someone needs your help or support, which doesn't mean you don't do it. It just means you filter it. And when you have set up your priorities well, priorities and intentions, essentially they set your reticular activating system to filter things through that priority list, filter things through your intention. And that makes the world much less chaotic and much less noisy. So for those of us who have really busy lives, connecting with this priority list and or intentions can be really, really helpful. And so the next questions that I would ask are, do you spend your energy in alignment with those priorities? And I like to say energy as opposed to time, because some of us are required to spend time at work, but we give way too much at work and then we get home empty with no energy for those things that were more important. And so that's where I use the word energy as opposed to time, because many of us are required to take the 24-hour call shift or whatever it is, and we need to do that to support our family. But what can you do during that shift? Or how much of yourself do you give? And sometimes it's even just treating your job as a job rather than a calling. And we are all probably amazing at our jobs because we're smart, amazing people. But we can expend less energy around the drama of, I'll give the example of being toxically independent. We can let other people do it and do it 75% as well, and it's going to turn out okay in the end. So that's, again, kind of asking your future self. Or how can you set up your day to have energy at the end for your family? And what I would invite there, and this is something we'll talk about a little bit more next time, is having pause, having rest, having micro breaks, practicing mindfulness, doing things that restore your energy. And they don't even have to take much time. Breathing restores your energy, for example. So pausing to take 3 breaths can be a way so that when you get to the end of the day, you're not negative with energy. And so that's, again, where the energy balance comes into play. And then what needs to change in your life so you can spend your energy on your actual priorities. And some people need to work less. Some people need a new job, but not everybody. A lot of times we need to change how we think about the job. We can let go of perfectionism. We can stop people pleasing quite so much. We can let go of over responsibility, give other people back their responsibility that's theirs.